Hey everyone, welcome to today's event. My name is Steve Vogt. I'm a senior product engineer here at Kanji. Before Kanji, I was at Apple for 15 years in various roles in retail, professional services, and the enterprise space. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that Mac admins have argued about for years. Should we make users administrator or standard user accounts on the Mac? With me today, I have Rich Troughton. Rich has been doing Mac and server administration for over 20 years in a number of different environments, including universities, government, medical research, advertising, and even software development. His current position is at SAP, where he works with the rest of the Apple at SAP team to support SAP's Apple community. Rich has also written for Peachprit, A-Press, MacTech Magazine on various ways to manage Apple devices. His most recent book with co-author Charles Edge is Apple Device Management, a unified theory of managing Macs, iPads, iPhones, and Apple TVs. Welcome, Rich. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Steve.
I feel like this topic just keeps coming up now more than ever of that admin versus standard user. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's pretty fundamental. It's also something that has kind of been there since Apple switched over from Mac OS 9 to Mac OS 10 and now onto Mac OS, where you previously on Mac OS 9 there wasn't really this dichotomy. You were the only user and you had total rights to do anything you wanted. It's much like iOS. But with the switch to Unix, you now had this. You had multiple user roles show up. You have, the Unix root user, which Apple really discourages you from running as, and because root could do anything. You also have administrators, which can add and manage other users. They can install apps. They can change settings. Um, and then you have standard users, which they can install apps via mechanisms like the App Store, and they can change their own settings, and they can even for drag and drop apps, they can probably, drag, like say, download Firefox and drag that into their own user folder. But they're really kind of limited to their own user account space in terms of what they can do. So administrators, on the other hand, they can pretty much change what they need to change. That's more limited now with things like system integrity protection and also the new privacy protections that Apple introduced a few OS releases back. Um, but there's still this you can do a lot more with an admin user than you can do with a standard user. And because you can do more, there is more potential risk in running as an admin user than running as a standard user, because a standard user really can just affect their own account, and really that's about it. Whereas an admin user, they can affect more. So you have that increased risk, but also you have that increased capability as an admin user where you don't have it as a standard
Yeah,
user.
well said. I think just to dig into that a little bit more, I think to really understand the debate, we have to understand some of those differences and some of those examples of, what an admin can do versus what a standard user can do. And I think especially, for those new Mac admins out there or even security teams who are less familiar with the Mac, I think there's some of that
Hmm.
important like fine print that we need to be aware of when it comes to the differences, right? It's not exactly like it is on Windows. Could you just dig in just a little bit more about, some of the things admin users can do on their Mac?
Well, for example, to look at it from, say, a settings point of view, like say you have a user who they travel a lot. They're going across different time zones, and for whatever reason, using location services to change their time zone settings doesn't work for them for some reason. Now, if you're an admin, this isn't a big deal because you can tell them if they call in, they're like, I'm in Barcelona, but my Mac is stuck on New York time. How do I fix this? If they have admin rights, you can say, oh, okay, go into system preferences, go to date and time, click the lock, it's going to have your admin user, it's going to have your username filled in. You put in your password, you hit OK. It's going to unlock those settings, and now you can change what you need to. By the same token, if someone is in a similar situation, but they're a standard user, you're kind of stuck. Um, hopefully you have something with administrative rights that can change that setting for them, or else the best you're going to be able to tell them is, when you come back from Barcelona, stop by my desk and see me, and I'll fix that. Of course, by that point, it's far, it's way past the point that it would actually be useful to have them stop by and do something about that. So that's a good example. I mean, having admin user rights gives the user just far more flexibility in handling their own things, and that does come with that flexibility does come with increased risk, which some places may choose not to have. They don't want to deal with it. They're simply like, okay, we'll just try to write scripts and tools that we make available via our management tool to handle every situation we can think of. But you're going to run into those situations you didn't think of.
Yeah. Yeah, and like conversely, if you think about standard users, what are some of the things you kind of mentioned one? Are there some other things that are really obvious ones that standard users can't do? I know a lot of chatter I've seen is, maybe around printers and things like that.
Oh yeah, like you need to have admin rights by default. You need to have admin rights to manage your printers. Now, it is possible to add um, either the regular. You can script it so that you're adding groups to the group that handles printing rights, and thus you give your standard users rights to manage their printers. But that's extra work. Whereas with admin rights, you just tell folks, yeah, just go click that lock in system preferences and do what you got to do. So I think that's kind of the trade-off. You may gain less risk, uh, but you are going to sign yourself up for more work because you're moving it from uh, kind of a self-service model where the user can take care of their own stuff to, well, you've taken away that ability from them. And if they can't do things with a self-service model, now you got to do it for them, or else they're stuck. So that printers are a great example of that, and time zone changes are a good example of that, and changing network settings, which these days is less of an issue than it was in earlier versions of Mac OS 10. Um, but but you have all these things that really ask for admin rights, and if you've taken those rights away, now you're having to do it, or at least provide a tool to make sure your users can
Yeah,
do
so
it.
the pros and cons, it sounds like that kind of that trade-off, as you said, right, is that for the IT admin, right, they're maybe reducing their risk, right, but they're also increasing potentially their workload of things that they need to figure out how to allow the user to do if they're possible.
Right. And some of this stuff is going to be in a reactive mode simply because you didn't think of it in the first place. The printer stuff is pretty well understood now. Things like time zone changes, they're a little tougher, but location services handles most of that. But you're going to run into things where it's like, oh, this person ran into a problem, and now we'll write a tool or a script to deal with that, but it's going to be after the
Mm-hmm.
fact. When that person first runs into the problem is probably going to be not solvable until you get a chance to work on their machine.
And do you ever see this with, is it mostly system settings? Do you see it at all like branching into apps? Like I remember early days in Mac OS 10, there was, a lot of times an issue if you had a standard user. Some apps were not developed in a way that really supported that model. And so they would just freak out. Do you still see a lot of that, or are most apps
Oh, sure.
pretty compatible?
Where I see that more often is with app updates, honestly. And a good example is, say, something like Firefox or Chrome, where they go to update and they'll pop up something that says, uh, I need to install like a helper app, and that requires admin rights. And that helper app will take care of updating whatever it is. Uh, you know, GitHub has something like that. Slack has something like that. And the idea is that you know this helper app takes care of the actual update process But in order to do that, it needs admin rights because it's trying to write to something in the applications folder, which is not writable by a standard user. So this is something where, with software updates especially, you may need admin rights to run those updates, um, because otherwise you don't have the rights to update that software. And especially these days when um, you have apps updating more and more rapidly, especially in response to security problems, having people be stuck like that is probably not a great security risk right there in
Yeah, so
itself.
it sounds like there needs to be a lot of thought and just testing put into even just down to the app level. Like, what apps am I giving my users, and making sure those are all tested. If you decide to go the standard user route, make sure you're doing your full suite of testing there.
Right. And also, it could be that you need to really evaluate what risks you have. Um, do you want something like, say, just as soon as an update comes out, do you want to send it out to the fleet? Uh, or do you want to test it? You know, is the risk of a bad update less than the risk of not updating? And do you want your users to be able to run their own updates, or do you want to manage this for them? And it's a lot. And it all comes, frankly, with dollars and cents attached,
Mm.
because all of this costs money because it costs time. And frankly, the more you need to have someone do this work as an administrator, frankly, the more skilled and experienced they're going to need to be, and that makes them more expensive. So you really have to look at this holistically, not just from well, I think it's a security risk. Okay, well, how much is that risk
Mm.
cost? And if you take a look at it, um, is that cost worth it? Because of course, if you ask some folks, they'll be like, "Oh, we'll pay any cost." Really? That's not been my experience. Some folks are like, "We'll pay anything. We'll pay anything. We'll pay anything." Well, it's going to cost you $10,000. We won't pay that.
Speaking of security, let's actually kind of move into that piece. Is looking at that kind of balance between security and usability. And first, if we look at security, when you make somebody an admin, how much risk does that actually impose on the organization?
I'd say that depends on what kind of risks and also regulatory requirements you have, because if you have requirements from that are legal that say thou shalt not run with admin privileges at all, well then that's it. That's the end of the argument. The law says you got to do it, so you got to do it. Um, if you are looking at, say, a developer environment, well, then maybe you're looking at, well, how high security is this developer environment? Like, for there's going to be all kinds of different levels of security that are needed. For example, if you're like a military defense contractor, you've probably got all sorts of rules that most developers who are trying to develop like an app to talk to Twitter never have to deal with. So to go along with those environments, you have to take a look at what are the rules that I have to follow, what is the client mandating. Um, but to kind of go along with that, Apple's been working on their own security model, which, frankly, in my opinion, makes the distinction between running as an admin user and running as a standard user less than what it was, say, even 10 years
Mm-hmm.
ago. And a good example of that is that you take a look at system integrity protection. It used to be that if you had root privileges on the box, you could do anything. But now that is very far from the case. If you take a look at what you currently have in Monterey, the OS system software that you're running off of isn't even running on an actual read write disk. What you're actually booted from is a snapshot of a cryptographically signed read only volume. You can't alter that. So, does it matter whether you have admin rights or no? Does it matter whether you're running root or no in that situation? It's a very different discussion now than it was, say, 10 years ago, because you can't alter those files. You just can't. They're read only and they're cryptographically signed. So if they're altered, maybe the OS doesn't boot. So that's very different from I could mess with anything.
So, Rich, how does device management layer in here, right? Like you mentioned, a lot of the built-in
Mhm.
stuff. How does device management also fit into the picture? And do you even need to make users like? Do they have any? Does that have any impact whether you are a standard user or an admin? Is it the same kind of restrictions, or what does that look like?
I don't really see a big gap. If you are managing things with MDM and you are, locking out settings that now an admin user cannot alter, aside from removing the machine from MDM management, which, as noted, you can do that with a non-removable MDM profile. You can, I don't really see a lot of difference in between um, running as a standard user and running as an admin user within that idea that your profile, you're using profiles to manage your
Mhm.
settings and locking these settings out from being edited.
Right. So it's not like the old days where you were just, layering on top settings locally and then locking those out. Now it's you're doing that with your device management solution, and they can apply regardless, right? If you're an admin or you're a
Right.
standard user.
Correct. Those will apply
Yeah. So if
regardless.
we look at it from a user perspective, so kind of flip the coin, um, for IT, does that decision of admin or standard have any impact down the road on how you support them? I know you touched on it early on, but just kind of to dig into that a little bit more.
So this decision does have impacts for both IT and uh, for the user communities that they support. But one thing I would really take a look at is that what do the IT folks themselves want to run as? Do they want to run as a standard user? I'm pretty sure the answer is no, and they'll usually write themselves an exemption of some kind that gives them admin rights but doesn't give their users admin rights. So they don't kind of run at the same level as their users. And they'll justify that by saying that, well, I need this. Well,
And how do you think this decision, just to kind of think about it from the user perspective a little more, maybe a little philosophical, how do you think this impacts the culture in the organization? Does it have any impact at all if you make your users an admin or a standard user?
so there's going to be instances where you absolutely are going to need to have these security requirements defined out and put in place, and uh, you're gonna have to follow them regardless. But if it's like, well, we're our own shop and we're just trying to follow best practices, well, then it really behooves you to take a look at what those best practices are and really try to figure out what makes sense for you, because security is supposed to help protect the business. It's not supposed to stop the
Mhm.
business. But too many shops are just like, no, we're not going to. They're not making the conscious decision to not look at it, but they're like, well, I got a lot of stuff to do, and this is what I've been told I have to do,
Yeah.
without doing a careful evaluation of what that means and what burdens that applies.
Yeah. Do you think by giving users admin privileges, first of all, will they know and care like the typical user? But more so, does it like maybe have some inherent trust, like hey, my company trusts me, or does it have any impact on that type of thing in the culture?
It absolutely does. If you give your folks admin rights, you're expecting them to be able to solve more of their own problems for themselves, while at the same time you are opening yourself up to some more risk. Uh, and anytime you're opening yourself up to more risk because you want to give that to someone else, that is trust. You're saying that I trust you to use this responsibly. In the case of, say, a business of adults, I'm trusting you to act like an adult who has been given a tool where the expectation is you're going to use it responsibly. Now, is that the same paradigm that you should apply to, say, a K through 6 elementary school? No. I have a 10 and 11-year-old. I have not given them admin rights to anything. Um, but it really boils down to you're handing off a laptop to a 35-year-old who managed to somehow get out of bed and get to work, and you're expecting them to do things that make money for your business. If you're trusting them to do that, Why don't you trust them with this?
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Privileges app and what problem it solves?
My teammates, Mark Thielemann and Harold Monahart, were both working for a German publishing company named Axel Springer, and they had a project where a number of folks were switching from Windows to Mac. And as part of it, some of the folks switching had never used a Mac before. They were familiar with how admin rights worked on Windows, and they were really afraid they were going to break something if they had admin rights on their machine. So it's kind of the reverse of what a lot of folks do, where they're like, well, I had admin rights and now I'm standard. These folks are like, you're giving me admin, but I want to be standard. So to help support this effort, two tools were created. One which helped people remove their accounts from the admin group, and then a separate one so that folks could add themselves. And the main motivation of this whole let's switch folks from Windows to Mac OS was to rethink how IT support was being done. And the goal was moving more functions from the help desk doing them for users to now users doing them for themselves. So at this point, kind of the proto privileges was two apps, and it was like shell scripts and stuff that was being written in like AppleScript Studio. And then later down the line, there was a further refinement where they were like, why do we have two tools for this? Let's roll this into one tool. And at that point, the move was made from AppleScript Studio and shell scripts to now doing it with AppleScript Objective-C. And then later, just moving it to Objective-C and getting rid of the AppleScript components. So later, Mark and Harold moved to SAP, and they had the setup at the time. This was like 2016. What was happening was that the help desk was centrally assigning devices to users, and then a script that ran on the machine would check to see, is the user on this machine supposed to be an admin? If they are, promote them. Um, and the problem was is that sometimes that script didn't work. So folks would expect to be admins, and now they're not admins, and now they're putting in tickets to the help desk, and now it's more work for the help desk, and you know, you just had this issue. And at the same time, there was a security audit being run where SAP's global security was like, we'd really prefer that folks not have permanent admin rights. We have less exposure and less risk if they have, we acknowledge that they're gonna need admin rights for some of their work, but we'd really like to set it up so that they're not running all the time with admin rights. And this is where the modern version of privileges really came from. So this actually solved two problems for SAP. You were able to get rid of this script that was failing part of the time, and you didn't have this need to centrally assign an admin to a user, but you also still had an easy way for folks to make themselves an admin when they needed to. And another thing that they had was a launch agent that ran at login that automatically demoted you back to being a standard user. So the way SAP has it is that you can use privileges to promote yourself to being an admin, but if you log out or reboot the box, when you log back in, you're back to being a standard user again. So, and you generally run that way, in my experience, until you run into something that needs you to have admin rights. And at which point you hit privileges, you promote yourself, and there you go. And so you have this cycle. And so this made our security folks happy, and it made our user community happy because you were able to satisfy the requirement that you're not permanently running as an admin, but at the same time, users knew that they just had to elevate themselves using privileges to get the admin rights that they needed. So there was no friction, and because it didn't have any network dependencies, you could do this anywhere. You could do this, someone was working on an airplane with no Wi-Fi at all, they could still get their admin rights. There weren't any obstacles in their way.
So you're reducing your risk, right, by making your users standard users in that case, but you're also reducing your support that's required because, hey, they need admin privileges for this and this and this and this. And maybe some of that admin overhead we talked about earlier of like thinking through all the scenarios of what does the user need admin rights for.
Right. Exactly.
So what is the experience from an admin perspective? Like, how do they, get the Privileges app, to the Mac? Like, what does that deployment look like?
Well, I can only speak for us, but we have this as part of our standard deployment setup. We also have compliance rules that our laptops and desktops need to follow, and one of them is you must have the Privileges app installed and set up. Um, so the idea is that as part of the default dock setup, we have the Privileges app included as one of the dock items. When you're a standard user, it'll show up as a green padlock icon that is locked, showing up as locked. And then you go and click on it, it'll pop up and say, you're currently a standard user. Would you like to request administrator privileges? There is a request privileges button and there is a cancel button. And if you hit request privileges, your account gets added to the admin group and now you have admin privileges. To reverse it, you just go back to that dock icon, which is now yellow with a unlocked padlock icon on it. Click it again, and it says you're currently an administrator. Would you like to remove administrator privileges and revert to a standard user? And you click, there's a remove privileges button and there's a cancel button. And if you click remove privileges, well, now you're back to being a standard user.
Awesome.
And
So
it's pretty simple and straightforward from my point of view. I'm sure there's someone who would look at it and go, well, that's completely cryptic. I don't understand that, but it seems to be fairly straightforward to me.
yeah, so you deploy it with like your device management
Mm-hmm.
solution. It sounds like, are there any other settings like that you need to set as an admin, or little things like that, profiles or things like that?
We do have profile support, but by default, no, you don't need to do anything. All you need to do is install it. It is a drag and drop app. Uh, and when you click on it the first time, if you are not deploying it with a installer package with a post install script like we do that configures everything properly, it'll pop up something saying, hey, I need to install a helper app. In this case, it's going to be like, other things that need a helper app. It's going to ask you for your admin username and password. Once you provide that, the helper app runs, and that's it. You're set.
Who's the right company, or what's the right organization to be using Privileges app? Like, should everybody go like, hey, I'm going to make my users standard users and use Privileges? Like, how do you make that decision to do that or not?
This goes back to your security requirements and what they require. I'm gonna offer this tool and say it's available to you if you want to use it. I'm not gonna say, oh yeah, everyone should use it because not everyone should. It really boils down to, do you trust your users with admin rights? If you do not, there is nothing about privileges that is going to solve that for you. Zero. If you are like, I just want to give my folks admin and never take it away, then privileges doesn't solve a single thing for you. Yeah, just maybe it introduces friction for you. But if you have a situation similar to us where we're like, we don't want folks to run with permanent admin rights, but at the same time, we want folks to have as little friction as possible to get them, then privileges is a great solution for that.
Awesome. Awesome. So kind of, we talked about a lot of different stuff, and I think, kind of debated about, hey, admin versus standard from many different facets. So often I feel like this decision to make users admins or standard users sometimes comes from, organization's leadership. Maybe it's the CTO or the security team, or, something like that. How do you communicate all of the things that we're talking about here to leadership so they can make an informed decision?
Well, first of all, it depends on what your security setup is. If do you have a dedicated security team? How deep is their understanding of Mac OS? Because this also plays a key role. That if the security team does not understand how Mac OS works, you're probably signing yourself up for an educational process with them. Um, if they do understand how this works, and they're still like, no, got to stick with standard users, that's a tougher argument to have. Um, if you are just communicating with management, maybe a good place to start is that, okay, so here's what we're going to try. This is with the assumption that your management folks have not written themselves an exemption to give themselves admin rights. Uh, Probably the place to start is what are the problems you see day to day on your Mac, and let's talk about which ones could be solved by granting admin rights. Now, if they have written themselves an exemption and they are running with admin rights, perhaps the place to start is, well, why did you do that? Let's talk about that and why this exception isn't being granted to everyone else. Are there reasons for it? And that can be a difficult discussion to have with management. It really depends on what kind of your company culture is, but overall, you really got to take that down to, I think, here's the advantages that we can get from it, and the advantages for me are more self-service for your users. There's also the company culture advantage of you're showing that you trust your users more. Uh, but also you got to take a look at what risk are you now assuming by doing this. So it is a very holistic discussion to have.
Yeah, so maybe just kind of like we talked about understanding, right? And it sounds like living on it is a really important thing, right? Of just really understanding what the day to day would be and communicating
Right.
that to your leadership of like, this is the things that they're going to experience, right? The good, the
Right.
bad, the ugly, right?
Yeah, and I would not say, let's start the argument by making you live as a standard user, because you're going to get pushback on that. You're taking something
Hmm.
away. Anytime you take something away, you're going to have this pushback. So maybe the answer is to try to figure out how to frame the discussion of, we want to give something and we want to show that we trust folks.
Hmm. And probably also, I think, important to show that, hey, there's so much device management can do to layer on the security regardless of your user type. Like, so kind of
Yes.
dispel that myth too right away.
Right. And that's a very, like I was saying earlier, like this discussion sometimes really hasn't changed in 20 years, but the security model certainly has.
Hmm.
So it might be a good time to just update that discussion to, let's talk about that. Yeah, 20 years ago, what you're talking about made a lot of sense. 10 years ago, what you're talking about made a lot of sense. Does it still make sense? Because we want to we want to constantly be evaluating things and using best practices and the best technology to achieve our goals, which is moving the business forward. And maybe it's time to have that discussion of, are the practices we're currently using helping to drive the business forward in the best and most efficient way?
Awesome. Such good advice, Rich. That brings us to time. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Rich, for providing us with such great perspective and increasing our understanding of this great debate. And if you are interested in SAP privileges, Kanji is proud to host it in our Auto Apps catalog for our customers. You can also do a quick web search where you're going to find it on GitHub. If you're interested in finding out how Kanji can help you deploy the Privileges app and create amazing user experiences for your organization, go to kanji.io/start to learn more.